Well, joining us live from Washington, D.C. is Marshall Anthony. He's Research Director at the Institute for College Access and Success. Marshall, good to have you with us. So what's your response then to this ruling by the Supreme Court? And what does it actually mean in practice for race-conscious college admissions?
Yeah, affirmative act, thank you so much for having me, but affirmative action has been a fundamental step in the right direction towards achieving racial equity in college admissions. However, today, as you heard, the Supreme Court sent a very clear message of sending higher education backwards by undoing critical progress made over the last several decades. But as President Biden stated today in his remarks, we cannot allow this decision to be a permanent setback for the country.
So how much is this a setback to the issue of racial equality, Marshall? I mean, if the Supreme Court is stripping away the very protection for students of colour to have equal access to higher education, this increases the impact of racial inequality, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's a huge setback. We know that race-blind and race-neutral approaches do not guarantee racial diversity and ignore systemic barriers that prospective students of color face in accessing higher education. If we looked at the 9 states that have already banned affirmative action prior to this decision today, the enrollment of Black and Latinx students at publicly funded flagship universities has declined, inhibiting their economic mobility. And so if we looked at those as examples, most likely we will also see that on the national landscape after today's decision.
Let's just stick with the issue of affirmative action for a second, Marshall, because it remains one of the most contentious issues in US education. Groups like the Asian American Coalition for Education argue that, look, affirmative action has negatively affected Asian American students' chances of enrolment at elite schools. They argue that because they aren't black, they're effectively discriminated against. What's your response to that?
I say that response is unfortunately it's unfounded. There's already a few number of Black and Latinx students who are in those positions, and so we're arguing over about 4 seats instead of having a larger conversation of how structural racism has negatively impacted the post-secondary access of students of color across the board. And so the conversation is a much larger conversation to have, instead of pitting groups that have been systematically disadvantaged across the board against each other. And unfortunately, that argument led to today's decision, all because of misconceptions and myths about who is already accessing and benefiting from a college education.
And a final thought, in terms of the broader political fallout, US President Joe Biden said he strongly disagrees with the Supreme Court ruling and said that the country now needs this new path forward that is consistent with the law because discrimination still exists in America. So what do you think this new path forward should look like?
Yes, fortunately, there are actionable steps that the Biden-Harris administration can take right now to remove barriers in college access for students of color. In addition to ending legacy admission that President Biden announced today and uplifted in his remarks, the administration should also push to eliminate standardized testing, merit-based aid, application fees, transcript fees, all of which disproportionately negatively impact the access of Black and brown students in higher education. We also know that there are institutions that have historically served students of color even prior to affirmative action, during affirmative action, and now in this moment that we are in a post-affirmative action era, that have been unfortunately underfunded. And so it's even more important for those institutions to have funding equity across the board. And we have seen movements to allow that to happen. Federal courts have even found patterns of inequitable funding in states in Maryland and Mississippi, and that have led to multi-million-dollar settlements. And I'm hoping that we see that more of that in the decades to come.
Marshall Anthony, really good to get your thoughts and your analysis on this topic. Marshall, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.
Thank you so much for having me.